Welcome back. And now we get to talk for a couple of weeks about us humans and our organ systems. More complex animals like we are, have specialized tissues with organs and organ systems. And such organisms like ourselves must maintain an internal environment that is stable in terms of temperature, water, and concentrations of nutrients, ions, gases, and some other chemicals. And we need that internal stability in regard to the outside being not stable. And so we need to create that. And that doing so is the term homeostasis is referencing to that. Body systems adapted to get nutrients, oxygen, and other resources from external sources and remove waste in a few ways. We remove solid waste through the digestive system, some liquid waste also, but then liquid waste primarily through the kidneys and also through the skin via sweating. And then the gas waste, we can get rid of that, like the carbon dioxide, for example. We get rid of that through the lungs, the respiratory system. Overall, the organism is centrally coordinating its activities through a brain and a spinal cord, and we collectively will call that then the central part of the nervous system, or we do call that. Homeostasis, so keeping that internal environment, we do that. That's homeostasis. So the ability to maintain a relatively stable internal body environment, even though the outside is changing all the time. That's the definition of it. So the word homeo, which you see up here, homeo means same, and stasis refers to as in standing still. This is a dynamic. So the standing still means that internal environment is stable, that stability. And this is a dynamic equilibrium that works around set points and continually adapt. So we have, the temperature is a set point, pH is a set point, for example, blood sugar we need to keep at a level. And we have many, many chemicals that need to be monitored and then also regulated within that narrow framework, the set point area. Thermal regulation, how the body keeps the temperature steady inside, is a good example of how to explain homeostasis, because we endotherms need to have a stable internal body temperature, and we can adjust that back via various means. So for example, if it's too hot, we can sweat and carry the heat out of the body that way. Also, the blood vessels near the skin can dilate and radiate heat out that way. And so that's how the body heat from the inside can dissipate to the outside world. If it's too cold, on the other hand, we can bring blood back to the core and reduce heat loss that way. Also, we have a subcutaneous fat layer, for example, or fur in feathers that can preserve energy. Another thing that we do is we can shiver, and unconsciously our voluntary muscles contract involuntarily, not unconsciously. It's conscious, but it's involuntary. And we can see that described up in here. We can see how when the body temperature falls, we have various ways, for example, restricting the vessels or conserving the energy that way, or not sweating, for example, or that shivering that we talked about. And that then is retaining the heat or creating some heat with the shivering, and that will bring the body temperature back to normal. On the other hand, if we, for example, have a body temperature that goes up too much, we can dilate the vessels that are near the skin. We can do some sweating, and then we can lose some of that internal body heat, and that will bring the temperature back to normal. Also, fur stands up and creates a thicker coat, and we have some of that, even though we don't really have that with us. Well, the head maybe, but not really the head. Fur standing up on the head. But we can see that in goosebumps when we get goosebumps because we have the muscle that attaches to the hair follicle. It's called the erector pili muscle, and that muscle, when you contract, it makes the hair stand up from a more 45-degree angle to a 90-degree angle. We already talked about the shivering. And then also, some animals transfer heat from arteries to veins by having them run parallel. And we call that counter-current heat exchange. See that right here, counter-current heat exchange. And that is observed in dolphins, sharks, bony fish, bees, and hummingbirds as examples. The hypothalamus, which is the brain structures deep inside, with the has autonomic reflexes in it. So it's a really small structure that has a lot of function with the autonomic nervous system, and then that responds to body function. And so that directs body responses to maintain a set point, for example, that temperature. And so that's the control mechanism, the control organ for the thermal regulation. And so that was sort of an example of what we call a negative feedback mechanism. Because what happens is let's say we get too hot and a stimulus right in here, that's number one. A stimulus is picked up, so it's like, it's too hot, it's too hot. And so that change is detected. And then from there, and see, that's a receptor then sending a signal into a control center, the central nervous system. That's that hypothalamus that we just talked about. And the hypothalamus then figures out and gauges, oh, are we too hot? Are we too cold? What are we going to do about it? And creates an output. And here's the output. And then the output goes and sends a signal to an effector that can have an effect, like the sweating or the muscle shivering, for example. And then that creates a response. And so in the temperature example, we're then back to normal, regular temperature that we want. And our body is therefore then back in homeostasis for the temperature and no longer in imbalance or out of balance. And we call that whole mechanism, with receptor picking up a change, sending a signal to the central command center, mostly the central nervous system, and then having a decision made, and then an output sent via an effector, efferent pathway to an effector, and then a change is happening. That's collectively called the negative feedback mechanism. And the word negative is not here to say it's bad. It's just the opposite. It could also be called the opposite feedback mechanism, which probably be more descriptive. Lots of things, not just the temperature is regulated that way. So this system sort of is important to keep in mind, of how a lot of things happen. Like calcium gets regulated that way, blood glucose gets regulated that way, and so forth. Fluids inside and surrounding cells are made up of water, electrolytes, which are the associated ions, and dissolved non electrolytes. Body fluids include blood plasma, intracellular, and interstitial fluids. The intracellular, the word intra means inside, so that's fluid inside of the cell, and inter means in between, and that's between the cells. Salt and water balance needs to be maintained across membranes, and that's that osmotic balance needs to be maintained. Body membranes are semi-permeable, which means they allow water and some solutes to cross while other ones can't cross. The body needs to be continually replenished with water and electrolytes. Excess is excreted together with waste by kidneys as urine. We also lose some of the liquids through the sweat and also some through feces, but the urine is the majority. The concentration of important electrolytes is specific to each fluid compartment and also across membranes. This sets up an osmotic pressure that moves water across the membranes. And salt, as we know, This is important. Salt influences blood pressure by that way, for example, because water follows salt. And so the more salt in the system, the more water will follow, the more volume of blood will create an increase in blood pressure, for example, or the opposite can also happen. The body removes liquid waste through the urinary system. And we have two kidneys that are located in the back below the liver. And we can see those kidneys right here. These are the kidneys. And then on top of the kidneys, we have the adrenal glands right here. Kidneys filter the body's blood around 60 times daily through more than 1 million nephrons. And a nephron is the functional unit of a kidney. So we can study how the kidney works on the nephron. And that's a filter with a long tube attached to it. And they ultimately are the ones that form the urine. Kidneys have three main regions. We have an outer cortex, a medulla below, and a renal pelvis deep inside. And the renal pelvis is an expanded end of the ureter. And so we can see that right here. We see the cortex right here. That's that top layer here. And then we have the medulla. And so that's sort of the inside of the kidney, the middle layer. And then the renal pelvis is right here. And here you see the ureter. And it sort of expands here at the end. It collects the urine and then it transports the urine down to the bladder. It collects the urine and then sends it to the outside world through the urethra. The renal artery diverts blood from the abdominal aorta. It enters the kidney with other vessels through what we call the hilum. And you can see that right here. Those are the artery. That's then the vein goes out. The nerves also is going in somewhere. And then we have the ureter that's coming out. That's the hilum. Capillary inside glomerulus create, filter, and let most water, many solutes, and wastes form a filtrate that enters a tubular system. And you can see that right here. You can see how here the arteriole at that point, it's a small blood vessel, and it comes in to the glomerulus, which is the capillary network here. And we often refer as the whole thing, this round structure, which has the capillaries, and then that creates a filter there, and then has a cup that the filtrate goes into it. And that whole structure here is known also as the glomerulus. The cup we also call the Bowman's capsule, but we don't worry about that terminology for us, just in case you're wondering. And then this here is the tubular system that we're talking about here, that comes off of the glomerulus. And much of the water, ions, and useful solutes are then reabsorbed in that tubular system back into the blood vessels, which is how the kidneys then regulate the blood volume. The waste will stay behind. And you can see the blood vessels. So you bring the blood comes in here, and then it exits the glomerulus on this end, and it parallels the filtering vessels, the tubular vessels. And so we can have the exchange of fluids happening there. And so lots of the fluid get first filtered and then reabsorbed. Other larger molecules, such as drugs that didn't enter the filtrate, are actively secreted and removed from the blood. And you have that here where you see that purple arrow is the secretion, and you see how that goes from the blood into the tubules directly. So those molecules did not get filtered in the glomerulus. They go directly from the blood, the efferent arterioles get actively moved into the tubules. And then from there, we collect the urine. Once we have all that done, that back and forth happening, and then it can go out down to here into the bladder, and then we can void it into the external environment. All right, let's now talk a little bit about the digestive system and how we get nutrients into our system.